So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Stephen Berlin-Johnson. Stephen helps us make sense of some of today's most complex and critical subjects. Stephen is a brilliant, cross-disciplinary thinker, someone who applies creative thinking and broad-ranging research and comes up with an intriguing and important view into how we live, work, and play. He's written several popular books on the intersection of science and technology and personal experience, and his latest work, the national bestseller, Everything Bad is Good for You, is one of the most talked about books of this past year. Please give a warm welcome to Stephen Berlin-Johnson.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you for sponsoring me. I feel like a NASCAR driver. Big logo and blazer. Thanks. So this is fun to be here. I hope this will be provocative. It generally is. What I want to talk about a little bit today is firstly give you a little sense of the argument of this book of mine. Tell you a bit about how I got to this, some would say, preposterous conclusion that popular culture is actually making us smarter and not dumbing us down. But then also look at the kind of mental tool set that's coming out of this new culture, because I think that's what's really of relevance to you. What kinds of skills are the kids growing up in this net-enabled blogging, video game playing world? What kind of mental skills are they really going to bring to the table as they grow up and as they go through school? So I'm going to start by kind of walking through a little bit of the argument and then really try and look at it at four kind of key attributes that I think are going to define this generation. So first, a lot of people ask me how I got to this book, and it really started with with an experience that had happened to me about 4 years ago, where I was on a vacation with my wife's family, and she at that point had an 8 or 9 year old nephew named Wyatt, and it was at a point, it was probably, I guess, 2001, and I had been playing the game SimCity. Now, how many of you have seen or played the game SimCity? Yeah, a lot of people. One of the best-selling games of all time, not an educational title per se, although hugely educational in a lot of different ways. And the 2001 version had just come out, and I was playing it a little bit on my computer, and so it was a rainy day on this vacation, and I thought, well, I'll show Wyatt this game. This would be kind of a fun way to pass a half hour or something like that. So I set up the game, and for those of you who haven't played it, just very quickly, I'll show a screen from it in a few minutes. But basically, you play this kind of mix of a kind of a big city mayor and a Robert Moses-like developer in the game, in the sense that you can build infrastructure, you can build sewer systems, you can build highways, and you zone for different types of industry, and you zone for different commercial developments and residential developments and different densities. All the things you would think kids would be really into doing. And the beauty of the game, as is the case with so many of these types of entertainment, is that you're not fully in control of the system. You can zone for all these things and build your infrastructure, but if you haven't done it quite right, or if you kind of place too much emphasis or you've forgotten something, the city won't grow the way you're hoping it will grow. So you'll have neighborhoods that don't take off, or a crime problem will develop, you'll have too much pollution and people will move away. And so the art of playing the game is kind of adjusting all these things. You can adjust tax levels and things like that, and trying to build the city that you have in your own mind. And there's no way to win the game, you just kind of keep playing it forever. But it's a very open-ended system and a very kind of problem-solving system, in the sense that you're trying to kind of figure out how all these different variables connect to one another. But I was showing it to this 8-year-old, and so I gave him what I look back on it now and think it was a pretty condescending tour. I think it was mostly a tour of the graphics, basically, where I would say, look, Wyatt, there's the mayor's house, that's where I live, and there are some schools there. Look at those little kids in the playground. You see that, Wyatt? That's great. And look over here, there's some big buildings, big tall buildings. And at one point, I showed him this industrial area that I had. And I've got all these factories here, and I can't seem to get them to take off. You can see this one is totally abandoned, and this one is all covered with soot, and this whole area isn't really working out for me. And Wyatt looked at the screen, and then he looked back at me, and he looked at the screen again, and he said, I think you may need to lower your industrial tax rates. And it was one of those moments you have where everything kind of crystallized, and I thought, what? You're 8. And, I hadn't explained any of this, just kind of looking at the screen and some basic familiarity with the vocabulary of games. He was getting this little lesson in urban planning and the relationship between taxation and development and all that kind of stuff. Now, if if you sat him down in an urban studies classroom and tried to teach him this kind of thing in a lecture format, he would be asleep or out the window in 3 seconds. He's 8, right? But something about the nature of the screen, something about the interactive nature of the screen, the sense of reward and play and possibility, was really kind of electrifying for him, and he was learning there in spite of himself, without even realizing that he was in a learning environment. So I've been following these kinds of trends. I grew up kind of in the gaming generation. You know, I grew up with Pac-Man and Pong. I remember the first kind of Pong machine showing up down the street. And I had seen this increase in complexity in the gaming world. But every time I looked around to see what people were saying in kind of the mainstream culture about the rise of these games and the amount of time kids were playing them, I found just quote after quote after quote that seemed to just not get it on some fundamental level. And I'll show you just 2, but I could sit here for the rest of our session and continuously show you these. This is a great George Will quote. Classic in form and in content. Ours is an age besotted with graphic entertainments, and in an increasingly infantilized society whose moral philosophy is reducible to a celebration of choice, adults are decreasingly distinguishable from children in their absorption in entertainment and the kinds of entertainments they are absorbed in. Video games, computer games, handheld games, movies on their computers, God forbid. This is progress, more sophisticated delivery of stupidity, right? So that's George Will. This is Dr. Spock, or whoever writes Dr. Spock's books now that Dr. Spock is no longer with us. This is the Dr. Spock Baby Guide updated for the new millennium, as the cover says. This is what they say about games after a long section about the importance of reading, which of course is perfectly nice. The best that can be said of games is that they help promote eye-hand coordination in children. The worst that can be said is that they sanction and even promote aggression and violent responses to conflict. But what can be said with much greater certainty is this: most computer games are a colossal waste of time, right? So this is the kind of landscape that was out there. What I found as I did more and more research for this book is that the increase in complexity and the increase in mental challenge that you see in the game world, which I'll show you a little bit more of, was not actually limited to games. And in fact, if you look at the overall state of popular culture, and look at it not from the way that we normally talk about pop culture in terms of values, in terms of violence or obscenity, but look at it in terms of the amount of mental work you have to do to make sense of your average game, your average television show, your average piece of software, all the different things that the kids are doing now. So the story of the last 30 years on television and games and the internet is the story of increased complexity, increased mental engagement, increased challenge. And I'll show you a bunch of examples of it. And so I decided to kind of call that trend towards more complexity, the sleeper curve, after that classic Woody Allen movie from the 70s where he wakes up 200 years in the future, and all the things that were supposed to be terrible for you turn out to be really healthy, like eating big fatty cheeseburgers and milkshakes and things like that. And there's great scenes in that movie where the doctors are saying, "Quick, you need to exert yourself. Smoke this cigarette right now." So the idea that there might be something interesting and mentally kind of challenging and productive going on, what generally was conceived of as a vast waste of time, kind of animated the overall argument of the book. Now, I want to look at 4 elements of the sleeper curve mind. What are the kind of skills that these kids are getting that we're not necessarily seeing because we're not necessarily testing for things like this? And they are system thinking, telescoping, social network mapping, and distributed collaboration. There are a bunch of others that are in the book, but these are the ones I want to look at and give you a few examples of. So the first is system thinking. Now, you know, SimCity is a great example of this. Is my lawn on? Yeah, you guys can hear me now as I'm walking and talking? Great. So, oh, wait, you really hear me. This is a screen from the most recent SimCity, just to review it. What you're doing in this kind of environment is you are dealing with the system with literally thousands and thousands of interacting variables. And every new development here, every new road build, every hospital has a little ripple effect on everything else around it. It's a massively complex system, much more complex in terms of the number of variables and the number of possibilities than, say, a game of chess is. It's a very complex, dense system. And what you do constantly is go in and basically query little elements of the game. So this screen up here, I'm sure you can't read it, but it's a little kind of readout for one office building, and it tells you the current jobs in that building, the wealth, the land value, whether it has power, whether it has water, how desirable it is in terms of crime and pollution. Every single building on the screen and the full size of the city would extend off easily through this room and beyond. I mean, it's a massive city if you could put it all on one screen. Every single building has little results like this. And this is your budget. You're running your budget. Every one of these layers, line items of transportation, public safety, you can click on and see more. So you're running this vast organization, and you're forced to think about it as a system, right? You're forced to think about it as a system made up of multiple components of interacting parts, none of which are really driving it, all of which have little impact on the overall kind of behavior. Now, this is a very important kind of intellectual engagement. You need to think this way to understand ecosystems. You need to think this way to understand political systems. You need to think this way to understand office dynamics. It's a hugely important way of thinking. And it is very hard to teach this kind of thought by reading a book or by sitting and listening to a lecture, as best as I'm trying to do here. The best way to do it is to sit there with the simulation and actually get your hands dirty and run through the different kind of variables. So this is a very powerful way of conceptualizing the world. And I would argue that the most kind of formal education kids are getting right now is through games like SimCity. Another game that came out actually since the book was released, which I didn't get to talk about, is the game Civilization 4, which was the #2 selling PC game in the fall. Again, a big hit. These are not marginal titles that are only played, in school when the kids have to. This is what the kids are choosing to play, and grown-ups, by the way. And Civilization 4 is a game in which you recreate the entire history of human technological and social economic development. That is the fun of the game. This is the civics screen in SimCity, in Civilization 4. So you know something's a little screwy when you've got a civics screen in a game that kids are buying, saving up their allowances to pay for. So these are different options. You can choose different forms of government, different legal systems, different forms of labor, different forms of economic development and religious systems. And there are 1,000 screens along those lines. So sometimes, when you hear people talking about, these violent games and Grand Theft Auto, ask yourself, what is the real news here about what the kids are up to? Is the news that the kids are basically using the latest technology to play cops and robbers in a slightly more explicit form than the previous generation did? Or is the news that the kids, for fun, are recreating the entire course of human economic and technological development? I think that that's the surprising development, and we tend to hear more about the former. Just to give you a sense of what people are talking about in this game, I went through the discussion boards, which are legion online. I mean, there are 1,000 discussion boards discussing how to play this game and different strategies and different experiences. And I just grabbed a couple of subject headers for the discussions, just kind of topics that people are having about the conversations about Civilization 4. So just to give you a snapshot of this very quickly. Some of these are pretty good. How do you guys control your workers at start? Basic labor management, crucial issue there. Then you have maybe a little bit of violence. How to start a world war? Just curious. I like this one. Religion, a few questions. It's one we all deal with every morning. Barbarians, how to deal with. Then you have the technophobes. Is there a way of hindering the space race? And then I love this great existential question. Is it ever worth it to not build a shrine with your first great prophet? Historian, Louis XIV versus Japan. A quick question on foreign policy. And then the last one, I don't even know what this means, but it just sounds so important that I wanted to put it up there. Beware of the sudden collapse experience. I don't know what that means, but I feel like it's important. So just that, if there's one takeaway from this talk, it's beware of the sudden collapse experience. It sounds like a band from the 60s, right? So that's some of the system thinking. Now let me talk a little bit about this idea of telescoping. Telescoping is the term that I kind of coined for this process of managing multiple objectives in an ordered, kind of sequential way. This is not multitasking. Almost nothing I'm talking about here, and in fact, what I talk about in the book, is about multitasking. No doubt kids are better at multitasking than I am, or you guys are. But all these things are about much more kind of structured, focused forms of thinking and analysis and decision making. You can't really multitask and play most video games. You can do a lot of things, but if you're not focused on a game, you will do poorly at the game. So telescoping is this idea of keeping a long view of your kind of long-term objectives in a game, and also keeping at the same time kind of a medium view and a short-term view. What do I have to do right now to stay alive? What do I have to do in this section of the game? And what are my ultimate goals? And the ability to kind of keep those, I call it telescoping in the sense of it's like a telescope where you have this kind of nested layers of different things that you have to simultaneously keep track of. This is, by the way, a very crucial form of cognitive work. If you aren't good at this kind of different objective management skills, you're not going to do well in life. That's what we sit there at the office and do. We sit there and say, okay, I got to do this short-term thing so I can get this proposal out, so I can get that raise, so I can buy that car, so I can marry that, whatever the goals are, in whatever order you've decided. So the best way to capture this without actually having you kind of sit down and play some of these games is to just put up here a brief portrait of the goals that are in the mind of a gamer when they're in the middle of a game. Like, what does that kind of architecture look like, right? So if you go back in time and scan the brain of your average Pac-Man player back in an arcade in 1981, this is the entirety of the objectives that they would have to keep track of. You have to complete the current maze. To do this, you have to move the little joystick around through the maze and avoid the monsters. And you can clear the board if you eat the big pellets, and then sometimes you can have the little bonus points. That's it. That's the Pac-Man universe that sucked so many quarters in 25 years ago. Now, fast forward to a game like The Legend of Zelda. This is a hugely popular franchise for the Nintendo system, played by 6-year-olds and 36-year-olds. It's a classic kind of rescue the princess story. Like so many of these things, the content is not the interesting thing about it. What's interesting is the form of thinking that you're doing, the kind of exercise you're having, not actually the kind of storytelling, which is basically a fairy tale. Now, this is the ultimate kind of overview of a game that takes about 50 hours to play. This is the Wind Waker, which came out about three years ago. By the way, just for the record, I don't have time to play games for 50 hours, but I do have research assistants who are very happy to play these games. This is a hierarchical list. Your ultimate goal is to rescue your sister. To do this, you have to defeat the villain. To do this, you need to obtain the weapons. To locate the weapons, you need the pearl. To get to the pearl, you need this. To cross the ocean, you need this. To do all the above, you need to stay alive and healthy. And here you get to the kind of basic metabolic level. And to do all the above, you need to just be able to manipulate the controller, which has gotten much more complex in today's Pac-Man. But this is just a broad strokes overview. What it really looks like, let's just zoom in on one of those levels, about 2 hours of gameplay in this 40-hour game. To locate the pearl, to get this you need to help the islanders solve their problem, and to do this you need to cheer up the prince, and to do this you need to get the letter from the girl, and then you got to do that, and then you got to do that, and 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 this would go on for another half page if I wanted to bore you to death. So, couple things about this. This is the kind of problem solving that is going on in playing these games. This is the level of complexity. It's not a purely open-ended system. Now, you can do certain things in different sequences, but you can't just do whatever you want, right? You have to kind of get through all these objectives. Most importantly, though, none of this is spelled out explicitly in the game. So all of these different levels, all these things you have to execute, you have to first figure out that you have to do them, and then you in a sense, do them. So what happens a lot of times when people who aren't familiar with this culture, when parents who haven't played a lot of these games sit down and play the game, they say, what am I supposed to do? And the kid says, you're supposed to figure out what you're supposed to do. And the kids are willing to sit there and explore and navigate these worlds to figure out this very complex system of rules and objectives on their own without a lot of guidance. In other words, what they're learning from these games, in contradiction to everything you've heard, is patience. The willingness to kind of stick with the problem and work it out and figure out the underlying rules. It's a very rigorous way of thinking, even if the subject matter is not as kind of artistically rich as one would like. And I'm sure there are some of you who are still saying, well, this is a little bit silly on some level because you're still talking about little kind of bomb-growing plants and locating the pearl and rescuing the princess. But I would argue that, in fact, this is much closer to, it's not a kind of literary form, it's not an aesthetic form, it's much closer to something that all of you will be familiar with. Simon is conducting a probability experiment. He randomly selects a tag from a set of tags that are numbered 1 to 100 and then to blah, blah, blah. What are the chances he'll match his number on the 100 crawl? This is from some Massachusetts aptitude test for high school kids. Now, you can look at this as a literary form as well, and it comes up wanting as well. You can say, who is this Simon character? We know nothing about his psychological, depth, and what is his motivation? Why would anybody do this? There's no metaphor here. Of course not. So what I would argue is that when you think about the kind of thinking that's going on in the game world, translate it into this kind of problem solving. So it's more like you need to cross a gorge to reach a valuable destination. At one end is good. What are these different options? Pick one. And if it doesn't work out, go back and experiment and explore and try and figure out what works better. So it's really about problem solving and managing these different levels of objectives. Let me move on to this other category of social network mapping and just talk a little bit about television, which is in some cases a harder argument to make. But for the record, I think the games are truly making kids smarter in a lot of ways, and that television has had to get smarter because of that. I think there's something fundamentally limited about kind of a passive to one-way form like television that makes it hard for people to really learn from it. But there is this increase in complexity. And one of the great measures of this is our ability to map complex social networks. Now we know from the brain science and from sociologists that people who are able to keep in their head large social networks of people, relationships with people at the office, people who are getting along, who are feuding, who's not getting along with the boss, who's flirting with whom, those types of people tend to be professionally and personally very successful in their lives. It's a great skill if you can kind of manage those complex networks. And particularly we know about the whole idea of the strength of weak ties, of people who have large social networks who are not necessarily just a small group of intimate friends. Those people also tend to have a lot of professional success. So we see evidence in the culture that our brains are being trained in a sense to manage, either internally or with the help of other kind of technological tools, to manage larger social networks. That's good news. That's, again, an important and kind of profound form of human thought. So let me just show you two representative charts of TV shows. This is a map of the social network of, anybody tell me what show that is? Dallas. This is episode 8 of season 1 of Dallas from 1978. In terms of the social network, just about the most complex show on primetime television at that time. A huge hit. There were lots of characters for that period of time. If you looked at most other shows, there would have been kind of half as many kind of major characters. And basically the way I've kind of drawn this up is that the thicker lines indicate, for this episode, relationships between characters that are crucial to understanding the plot of this episode, which happens to be called Black Market Baby. It is unbelievably boring, by the way. I encourage you, sometimes when I have more time, we'll show 5 minutes of it, but people just fall asleep. You can't believe how slow this show is. This was the hottest show on television in 1978, and it's like the creators think that everybody watching it has an IQ of like 70. So all the scenes are like, these two people are brothers. Anyway, so this is the social network. These are all the characters who appear in this episode, right? And this is a map of season 1, episode 8 of the hit TV show 24 from a few years ago. This is one episode of 24. All these characters appear. And 24 is basically, for those of you who say, I'm not going to give anything away, for those of you who haven't seen it, but it's a story of kind of 4 families, basically. There's the Office family of the Central Terrorism Unit. There's Jack Bauer's family, the hero, played by Kiefer Sutherland. There's the rising presidential candidate, David Palmer, and his family, and then there's the evil Drazen family. Now, interestingly, this is actually the structure. If you did a social network map, which is a very interesting way of looking at kind of cultural forms. If you did a social network map of the classic 19th century British estate novels, this is what it would look like. This is the scale of Middlemarch. This is the scale of most of Austen's novels. It's kind of 3 or 4 families, about 25, 30 characters, lots of interconnections between them. So, now, I'm not saying that 24 is anywhere near the artistic achievement of Middlemarch, but in terms of the social network complexity, in terms of how much you have to keep track of, it does rival that kind of show. And in fact, it's more complicated because it's a mole plot, so there are 4 characters you think might be the mole who you worry about and are constantly thinking about their relationship to the Drazen, even though the relationship is not spelled out. So it's a very complicated form of thinking. And this is a huge hit show. This is not a show that people are running away saying, I can't keep track of all these characters. If you put it on the air 30 years ago, people would have said, I simply can't do it. This is too complicated for me to follow. When Hill Street Blues came out in the early 80s, which had about, kind of a half of this complexity, it got the best critical reviews of any show that year, 1981, and it finished basically dead last in the ratings. All the tests, all the focus groups said the show is too complicated. We cannot follow all these people. NBC eventually came out 4 years later with a press release saying, we admit it, the show was too complicated, we're going to dumb it down a little bit, we're going to have less characters, less plot lines. So something has changed in the popular mind over those 20 years to make this show much more complicated, intelligible, readable to people. A show like Lost, which is an even bigger hit, is even more complicated. Now, the other form of social network complexity and mapping that we see out there is the much talked about MySpace, where every teenager in the world now has a homepage on MySpace. And this is just one random teenager from New Jersey who I found, Katarzyna. And I just want to show you one little thing that I love on her page. It says, Katarzyna has 248 friends. And they're all intricately mapped out, and you can follow all the relationships to all 248 of them. So the kids are using this technology, rather than just sitting there alone in the room, they're using this technology to extend their social network. Now, I'm sure these 248 friends are not Katarzyna's closest friends. But what she's doing is she's sensing that there's a technology that will extend her weak ties out there, and she's embracing it. She's really kind of reaching for it. The other thing that's happening is that kids and grown-ups are using this technology to make new connections and then go and gather together in real-world spaces. So it's not just about isolating yourself and dealing with people virtually. It's about using the connective power of the net to meet people and then go and meet in a Starbucks or in somebody's living room or anywhere else. And the best example of that is the wonderful site meetup.com, which is designed precisely to do that. It was crucial to the Howard Dean campaign. But it's not just a political site. You can see the popular groups. It's everything, I'm sure you probably can't read that, but the Chihuahua Meetup, the Democratic Party, but also the Dungeons and Dragons Meetup, the Entrepreneur Meetup. The #1 group is stay-at-home moms on Meetup. But, the witches are also really popular, too, at the same time. So, you've got a great kind of mix of all these different groups that are using the net to get together and have that kind of social connection that you can get by extending your social network out, building a bigger kind of map. And finally, the last one is this idea of distributed collaboration, which is really crucial on so many different levels. And I'll just show you a couple of examples. One from television. This is something that I found online. This is a map. Anybody know what this is? I bet not. This is a map. That's good you don't, because if you do, you have too much time on your hands. This is a map of the underground lair that was revealed at the beginning of season 2 of Lost, the huge hit show, that some insane fan created about 2 days after the first episode aired. I don't want to give anything away, but basically there was this underground lair that was revealed, and you see it for about 20 minutes of this first episode of season 2, and there are a bunch of different shots of it, but there's no, let's show you the overview. This guy or gal just sat around piecing together, sitting there with his TiVo and his pause button, piecing together all these different relationships. And all those little pink dots there are numbers that correspond to this annotated description of how he or she pieced it all together. And so you can see here that this is number 1 of the bunk beds, and you can see the little screen grab that he used or she used to figure out the relationship of the bunk beds. And this actually, I'm going to knock over the screen. This actually shows you the angle of the camera in that scene and how they figured out the relationships between all this stuff. And it goes on. There's something like 44 different items, so it just goes on and on and on. There would be another 16 pages like that. Never underestimate the power of people with too much time on their hands combined with the web. The web was built out of people just following their crazy passions. So all these shows are and games are filled with this amazing kind of annotation of kind of group collaborative effort to figure out and document all these different things that are happening in the cultural world. Another example, I'll just do this quickly. You should go check it out. A technology site called Dig, which is very popular now. It's a great source of technology news. It's entirely, the front door of it, all the different stories are entirely collectively organized by all the members of the site. So basically, people who read the site just go out and they stumble across an interesting new press release or some crazy thing that somebody's put online, or an op-ed that's relevant, they think, to the community. They suggest the link, and then the entire community votes on whether that link is interesting or not. And then, depending on the votes and the speed with which the votes are coming in, this front door of news, headlines with links, is kind of democratically elected, basically. And this thing is consistently more interesting and on target and timely than any other professionally edited news source out there. So this is this great kind of distributed collaboration between the 100,000 or 500,000 people who read this site. And it's a very powerful way of discovering new things and sharing it rapidly. It's a fantastic tool for large organizations and other things to look at. Now, I just want to show you one or two more things, and then maybe we can take a couple of questions. But to start telling you my favorite story about the reception of this book when it came out a year ago, and I had a million conversations about it and did a lot of interesting things, but my ultimate favorite was, it came out about 3 weeks after it came out in the States. It came out in the UK, and so in the middle of kind of a crazy publicity tour for it here, I flew over, it's kind of endurance test, flew over to England overnight, and jet-lagged on 2.5 hours of sleep, was immediately thrust on all these, national British television and radio shows, which is not a fun thing to do. Because I was a little bit worried about this book over there because, they do have the BBC over, and it's one thing to talk about how much better things are since the days of Dallas, but the BBC is a slightly more austere tradition, and I thought perhaps a American kid coming over and talking about how great American TV and games were would not necessarily be received as well. And so my publicist over there said, look, here's the first booking. We're going to put you on this very prestigious cultural affairs show on BBC Radio 4 or something. And the format is, there's a moderator, he'll ask you to make your argument, and then an esteemed British cultural critic will respond. And I thought, okay. Bring me up, right? So I get there late, so I don't even get to meet the esteemed cultural critic and get a read on him. And they drop me down. And the moderator says, all right, Mr. Johnson, give us your argument. So I do this jet-lag rendition of my argument for 10 minutes. And then the moderator turns to the esteemed cultural critic and says, so, Nigel, what do you make of Mr. Johnson's argument? And I don't even know if Nigel was his name, by the way. It just seems like Nigel should be his name. And Nigel proceeds to say the least likely sentence that I could have possibly imagined, which was, he said, well, I have to say that I was rather shocked that Mr. Johnson managed to write 250 pages defending popular culture and never once mentioned Buffy the Vampire Slayer. And then he proceeded to just deliver this 10-minute monologue about the kind of ontological complexity of Buffy, which had me totally persuaded. And in fact, afterward to the paperback, I talk a little bit about Buffy. So just to end with a little learning from Buffy.
That's great.
This isn't provocative enough. I don't know what it is. So just a couple of examples of things that are out there. There is, particularly in this kind of distributed collaboration mode. This is the Buffyology. This is an online searchable encyclopedia of every Buffy character, episode, cast member, writer, and director, and every word of every show in a searchable database. And somebody has just put up for the love of it. Right? This is the Wikipedia entry for Buffy, right? Wikipedia, of course, is on everybody's minds these days, and you can see this is one of those great examples of something that is not in the Britannica, right? They don't, even if they had enough time, I'm not sure if they would make it to Buffy. And it goes on and on and on. It's got a lot of kind of details, and then it does, in fact, get some metaphorical nature and moral connotations, which perhaps was written by Nigel, I don't know. But anyway, it keeps on going. And then these are the Buffy Meetups. So fans from all over the world are meeting up. There are 4,000 members getting together to talk about their show. But I think most powerfully, it's better to look at, and the show's been off the air, so there aren't quite as many of them, but these are the vampire meetup groups. And let me just tell you, these are not fans of vampire shows. These are people who self-identify as vampires. So, talking about the power of the internet, it's hard to, one, know where all the vampires were. You can see they're right along there on the eastern seaboard, a lot in San Francisco, no surprise there. But I actually, it's a joke, but I mean this seriously in terms of thinking about the kind of the power of extending your social network. It was hard to be a vampire before the internet. It was hard to meet other vampires, You could only go out at night, it's dark. But now the vampires are getting together, and that's, I think, a good thing as long as you have plenty of garlic if you're not a member. So just to wrap up, these are the kind of, you know, the four kind of values, I think, and there are more in the book if you want to check it out. System thinking, telescoping, social network mapping, distributed collaboration. But the crucial kind of, two crucial things, one of which is not up there, but I just want to add it. But the first is, as this idea that entertainment equals challenge. That people really do want to be challenged by the things that they're being entertained by, and that this kind of myth of the slacker mind, that we will always want the lowest common denominator, we'll always go for the cheapest, quickest pleasure. If that were the case, then the history of video game design would be the history of the game designers competing to create the easiest game they could. And the ultimate game would be one where you just flew through the world like a superhero, and you had infinite power, and you could control everything, or your city would instantly run the exact way you wanted it to. In fact, the history of games has been the exact opposite. The games are getting harder and harder and harder. I sat there for 10 hours trying to figure out how to play Civilization 4, and I write about these things for a living, and I couldn't even figure it out. So there's this enormous complexity and challenge to these things that is really amazing, and that a certain generation sees as fun. That's an amazing piece of news, I think. And the other basic element here is that all these forms of entertainment, even to some extent the television ones, when you're dealing with a show like Lost, where there really is this open invitation to look deeper into it, they're all about, on some fundamental level, decision-making. Whether it's deciding to kind of participate online and post something to your blog or your MySpace, whether it's deciding the best strategy in SimCity or Civilization 4, or whether it's trying to kind of decide the best strategy in deciphering what's going on in the universe of Lost. Now, there are many, many immense things that you get out of reading books. I write books for a living. I think the books are incredible. I could give a much longer speech about the power of books. But on some fundamental level, reading a book is not the same form of decision-making as you'll see in these games. In a sense, reading a book is about learning the lessons and wisdoms from other people's decisions and kind of being able to map those. But in any given moment, in any game, in many of these other forms of interactivity, you're sitting there evaluating the information in front of you, evaluating all the different variables, and deciding the best strategy going forward. And for all the importance of books and all the importance of traditional educational venues, I don't think there's a more fundamental definition of what it means to be smart than the ability to make the right decision at the right time based on the available evidence. And that's the kind of education these kids are getting, like my nephew Wyatt, without even realizing it. So, thank you very much. I think we've got a few moments for questions, right? I'm looking for cues, okay? Yeah, so is that mic live over there? Or you can just shout. Yeah?
Can I ask you?
Yeah.
In the world of education, in the way teachers are responding, did you find any information? Did you devote any of your book to this? How does all of this change what goes on in the classroom?
You know, I kept it limited, really, in the book to this world, and with the hope that it would spark a conversation in the kind of educational world. To some extent, that has happened. But, you know, one of the most interesting ones, I don't mean to brag about this, but I went to, well, okay, I will. But I went to Davos this year and asked a question about games on this panel that Bill Gates was on. And Gates turned out had read the book, and he was saying that a lot of the arguments that I was making dovetailed with a lot of what his foundation had found in the educational world, that part of the problem with schools that are having trouble is that they aren't challenging the kids enough, paradoxically. And that the irony of the game world is that the game designers all assume that the kids are incredibly smart and willing to be challenged and really will embrace this stuff. And it's harder to kind of get the schools to think that way. And it may partially be because there are certain structures to game experiences that are more enticing to the